When Alexander the Great set out east from Macedon on his world-conquering expedition, he had in his mind, more or less, a map of the world which he had inherited from the poets, a vision of the entire inhabited world floating in a great body of water. This was a concept entrenched in the mythological geographies of the beloved bards, such as Homer and Hesiod. And as far as anyone knew, when Alexander and his troops set out east with their eyes turned to unknown horizons, it was a fairly accurate description of reality. So when these intrepid men found themselves in the unimagined valleys of the Indus River, aiming for the Ganges and worlds away from familiar lands and customs and gods of the Greek world they had left behind, Alexander was still confident that if only he followed the Ganges east, eventually he would at last come to that far distant eastern coast of the inhabited world, and his conquests would be complete. The waters he anticipated peering out upon then from that ultimate eastern shore would be, he thought, the same waters that circled all the way around the wild ones he knew beyond the safe harbours of the Mediterranean to the west, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the waters which we now call the Atlantic. For the Greeks believed that one encircling, back-flowing stream flowed around the great continental landmass, and that this was the great source, a divinely flowing freshwater stream from which originated all the world's rivers, springs, and seas. For the Greeks and Romans alike, these waters were simultaneously a place, a being, and a god. These waters were the outer sea, the unnavigable far edges of the world. They were the periphery from which the moon and sun and stars rose and into which they set. And just as they were the source of all the life-giving waters of the mortal realm, so too they marked the boundary and extremities of that realm. And so the deity upon whom we call in this episode is the ultimate source of all the deities of the watery domains which we have visited in the past few episodes. But he is also the ne plus ultra of our explorations, meaning there is nothing beyond. He is as far from Rome as we can wander, and he laps at the edges of all there is. To visit him, we must cast a weather eye to the horizon, but acknowledge at the same time our mortal limitations, and recognize that he is, by nature, as he always was, a mystery ever beyond our reach. So come, let us stand, as Alexander once hoped to do, on the far distant edges of existence, and ponder the limits of success. Come, listen to the waves roaring into the abyss, and let us enter the realm of Oceanus. Oceanus, the world-encircling sea, the ocean stream, is easy to spot in Roman art. He is a great, dishevelled, bearded man with lobster claws coming out of his forehead and sea creatures leaping in and out of his flowing, watery hair. In Greco-Roman myth, he was a Titan, and these were the first generation of gods born to Uranus, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. He therefore belonged to the primordial generation of gods who represented immense natural forces and who had ruled the cosmos before being usurped by the Olympians who came after them. There had been a great struggle for supremacy and a protracted battle between these two generations of gods, and this is known as the Titanomachy. The Olympians eventually won and overcame their Titan forebears, who were thereafter banished and imprisoned in Tartarus, the deep, gloomy caverns of the underworld, abject beneath Hades itself, and surrounded by a triple layer of night. They were thus contained. Atlas escaped this fate, but only because he was otherwise punished by being tasked with perpetually holding up the sky ever after. Oceanus himself escaped punishment altogether because he had remained neutral during the battle and had not fought alongside his fellow Titans, and maybe he even favoured Zeus. True to his nature, he was immense and powerful, but remote, and so he remained disconnected from the affairs of the world, even the divine world for the most part. So while the rest of the Titans were conquered, disarmed, and contained, he remained out by the horizon and was left swirling around the world, as he always was, far beyond everything, in the company of his wife Tethys, who was also a Titan, and the embodiment of fresh water, springs, and rivers. Even in the new Olympian order, you'll rarely hear about him leaving his realm to visit anywhere else. This does happen in a few instances in some Greek versions of his story, and we'll think about that in a moment when we look at the different ways he was depicted in art from Greek to Roman times and consider how these differences reflect different ways of thinking about Oceanus. But overall, even the gods, supping their ambrosial nectar above the clouds, seemed to recognize his remoteness and great power and antiquity. Accordingly, his presence among mortals too, Greek and Roman alike, was always felt as a primordial force that surrounded them at an immense distance and flowed in to them from that impossible and unreachable place via the waterways of the world. So, here is a god who, even in the Greek world, was, if not in the shadows of Olympus, then certainly on the periphery of the Olympian order, as a Titan who came from before and beyond the remit of Zeus. In Rome, in terms of the religious landscape, Oceanus remained, as he had since the times of Homer, the very definition of the edges of that landscape, one of the most venerable gods living in the current order, at the green earth's utmost bounds, as Homer put it, calling Oceanus the parent of the gods. Sentiments we still find echoed in Ovid, for example, in imperial Roman times, calling him old Oceanus, whom all the gods revere. So it's high praise and a lofty pedestal, isn't it? Although I suspect if anyone had asked you about Greco-Roman deities of the sea, it would have been Poseidon or Neptune that came to mind. And I suppose with good reason. Just as for ancient people, encounters anyone was likely to have with the sea were likely, for the most part, to happen within the Mediterranean or the Black Sea, which were treacherous enough, but bordered by land. These were considered internal seas, and these waters weren't the domain of Oceanus. So really, for the most part, Oceanus was far distant from any kind of activity most people were getting up to, and his world-encircling presence, while intrinsic to the world view, had little bearing on its day-to-day maintenance. Moreover, Titans in general didn't receive temples and cult worship. So it was Poseidon or Neptune you were likely to be worried about as you put your boat to sea, or indeed a tempestuous goddess who we'll visit in the next episode. These were the gods of the waters people had to navigate, and so these were the gods that needed attention and careful worship in exchange for their goodwill and benefactions and good weather. It was only when you got a character like Alexander, who raised his eyes to the far horizon, that Oceanus really came into view. Alexander the Great was one of humankind's larger-than-life adventurers who had the kind of gusto and cockiness, charm, savvy and luck that would allow him to set these untenable shores in his sights. Now, people will argue until kingdom come about what sort of character Alexander was and what his driving motivations were, but the ancient sources all agree on one thing, that he had what they called in Greek pothos, which we translate insufficiently in English as yearning. It's a deep, even painful desire for something absent or unattainable. And this is the characteristic expression which we always see in depictions of Alexander. His face is at once illuminated and tortured by this longing for things absent, distant, or lost. And for my part, as someone who's been a rambler and a gypsy since her teenage years, decades ago, still with no fixed abode, and someone who's always felt some sort of compulsion to just keep going, I've always felt that Alexander has some recognizable traits. Warmongering delusions of grandeur and megalomania aside, of course, I've long suspected that he also simply had that same compulsion to move. Robert Louis Stevenson is another one. I travel not to go anywhere, but to go, as he said. The great affair is to move. And it's curiosity and wanderlust, I suppose, on the one hand, but it's much more than that. It's a sense that so long as the road keeps going, so long as there are unknown places and people around the corner or over the hill, then that beyond, and the back of that beyond, is ever the destination. So I think in those regards we can be quite sympathetic to Alexander's pothos and his drive to just keep going to the ends of the earth, to the ends of the ride, striving but knowing all the while that the ineffable, sought-after thing is always but always out of reach. And I think one way or another it's something many of the intelligent and introspective viewers of this channel will also have experienced and empathize with. I think to a great extent it's part of the human experience, which some of us pay more attention to than others, and some of us give more rein to its demands. But I would suggest that it's the same thing that time and again brings so many of us to the sea, the compulsion to go to the edge of the land and just sit staring and sighing for reasons we can't quite explain at the horizon. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by, and a wheel's kick and a wind's song, and a white sails shaking, and a grey mist on the sea's face, and a grey dawn breaking. That's the opening stanza of John Masefield's wonderful poem, Sea Fever. And it's such a popular and much loved poem because that compulsion, that yearning he's describing for the sea is so common and so keenly felt by so many of us. And this is at least part of what Oceanus represents. Not the seas into which we dip our toes or plough through, tossed about by waves, but the sea beyond that, at the unattainable horizon. And for some, Oceanus evoked, I think, that strange sense of desire, nostalgia, captivation and loss as we listen to the strange roar of the waves calling from a place we somehow feel intimately and yet to which we can never go. Not that Roman morality thought that these were sentiments to aspire to, and indeed, as we shall see, Oceanus didn't represent a dreamy somewhere over the rainbow sort of optimism, but rather a no man's land and a desolation. So yearning for such a place and setting out for Oceanus was either egomania or madness. Well, whatever his drives and motivations, Alexander wanted to reach Oceanus on the other side. And he'd known before he set out that India existed, and indeed conquering India was one of his primary intentions. because India was thought to be the easternmost country in the world. Writers as far back as the 5th century BCE, like Herodotus, had known of the existence of India, and people knew some fantastical things about this almost legendary place, such as the famous rumors that there were ants there that dug up chunks of gold from the soil. What wasn't known was its vastness, and the vastness of the lands beyond it, and beyond them again. So it was that after 8 years of trials and tribulations, facing all manner of hardships and fighting strange armies with new terrors such as battle elephants, with only more land reported over the horizon and fresh armies waiting with yet more unknown customs and military tactics, Alexander's army finally stopped and refused to go any further. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River in what is now the Punjab in Pakistan marked the point at which Alexander's loyal soldiers, tattered, battered, exhausted and homesick, demanded they stop their endless conquests and either start new lives in these new lands or go back to the world they knew and the people they missed. The Roman rhetorician Marcus Porcius Latro put these words into the Macedonian soldiers' mouths. Lead, and I follow, but who guarantees me an enemy? Who guarantees me land, or daylight, or air? Give me somewhere to place my camp, to set my standards. I have abandoned my parents, I have abandoned my children. I ask for my discharge. Is it too soon to ask that? On the edge of the ocean? A moving plea, but they weren't, in fact, on the edge of the ocean. The Hyphasis River marks the easternmost point of Alexander's conquests, but it was a long, long way from the easternmost coast he was seeking. However, as Alexander reluctantly agreed and, bowing to the pressure from his troops, turned to head south, the historian Arrian tells us that before setting out, Alexander made sacrifices there at that easternmost limit of his expedition to Oceanus. And this moment really does give us a glimpse into Alexander's psyche, I think, because the old man of the ocean and those far distant horizons were very clearly on his mind. Now, the sacrifice was supposedly because in turning south and following the Indus through what is now Pakistan, the men would again be heading for the sea, and indeed they would, after a horrible march, eventually reach the mouth of the river in the Arabian Sea near modern-day Karachi. But surely there was also something loaded and wistful in this moment, sacrificing to the sea beyond the shores he never saw. And when he reached the southern shores and the Arabian Sea sprawled out before him, he made spectacular sacrifices to Poseidon, in which bulls and libations and golden cups were tossed in its briny waters as offerings. Another historian, Diodorus Siculus, tells us that Alexander must have realized at that southernmost coast that his expedition, like the land itself, had reached its limits. And so Diodorus relates that Alexander raised altars to Tethys and Oceanus on those shores by the Arabian Sea. I love to imagine them buried out there somewhere still on the coast of Pakistan, with the ghosts of Alexander and his offerings to Oceanus still lingering there quietly in the shadows. But what does all this Greek and Macedonian history have to do with Roman religion? Why have I dallied so long with Alexander if we're in search of Roman Oceanus? Well, for one thing, this is one of those places where the Greek inheritance does matter. Oceanus continued to loom large in the Roman consciousness and imagination, not only in terms of religion, but in philosophy, geography, and history too. The ways in which Romans thought about their world and their place in it as a society and as individuals. Oceanus was always out there at the edges, like a frame that contained the whole. And for another thing, Roman society's orientation towards Oceanus had a lot to do with Alexander's own relationship with that grand old man of the sea. On the more logistical, practical side of things, apart from the massive geopolitical upheavals Alexander's campaign brought about, which was the world stage onto which Rome would emerge, his explorations also advanced geographical knowledge, and so the edges of the known world stretched the map a little further out. The mental map of the poets was giving way to quantification and measurement. By the High Roman period, when the entire Mediterranean was encircled by the Roman Empire to the extent that it was considered simply the Roman Sea, and Roman trade was regularly venturing to far distant lands for exotic and lucrative goods, geographical knowledge was still more improved. Homer, however, as a poet, remained regarded as a sort of foundational geographer well into the Roman period. So we find the geographer Strabo, who lived in Asia Minor during the early Roman Empire of the 1st century CE, asserting, "Both we and our predecessors do justly regard Homer as the founder of geographical science, for he not only excelled all, ancient as well as modern, in the sublimity of his poetry, but also in his experience of social life. Thus it was that he not only exerted himself to become familiar with as many historic facts as possible, to transmit them to posterity, but also with the various regions of the inhabited land and sea, some intimately, others in a more general manner, for otherwise he would not have reached the utmost limits of the earth, traversing it in his imagination. First, he stated, the earth was entirely encompassed by ocean, as in truth it is. Afterwards, he described the countries, specifying some by name, others more generally by various indications, alluding to those farther east and west as the lands washed by the ocean. For in ocean he believed both the sun and constellations rise and set. Now, from the gently swelling flood profound, the sun arising with his earliest rays in his ascent to heaven shone upon the fields. And now the radiant sun in ocean sank, dragging night after him over all the earth. The stars also he describes as bathed in the ocean. So we may note among the poetry that here is Strabo in the 1st century CE still asserting that the earth was encircled by Oceanus as an accepted, true geographical fact. And he goes on in a lot of detail to try to set out, north and south, east and west, the geography of these outer coasts and islands whose shores are the last to jut into the waters that give way to Oceanus. Some of these places are approximations of real places, and others are off the map of the maid. But geographically, Oceanus is still there. He simply got pushed further out to sea, and he underwent a few changes accordingly. Unlike the old Greek vision of Oceanus being a freshwater stream flowing around the edges of a disc-shaped earth, since there was now a general knowledge of the world being a globe, Oceanus, in his Roman incarnation, was a saltwater deity. And you'll see him in these fabulous Roman mosaics rearing out of the ocean like the primordial deity that he is, with kelp in his hair and fish in his beard and salt water streaming from his mouth. Another thing that changed with Oceanus's Roman incarnation was his body, or rather his lack of one. whereas Poseidon, or Neptune, lived in the sea and his domain was the sea. Oceanus was the outer ocean. In other words, he was a body of water. And this was certainly a concept in the Greek world too, but as I mentioned, in the Greek tellings, sometimes, though rarely, he left the water altogether, which meant he needed a form of some sort. His earliest extant appearance is on the famous Francois vase, which is a Greek vase of a kind properly called a volute crater, and it was made in the 6th century BCE. And on this vase are scenes illustrating pivotal scenes from myth and epic poetry. Oceanus is depicted attending the fateful wedding procession of Peleus and Thetis, where the seeds of the Trojan War were first sown. Thetis was the mother of Achilles, and she was a sea nymph. So Oceanus was there attending the wedding in support of the progeny of his watery domain. On this vase, only his name remains, and part of a sea snake, which may have accompanied him, as it often does in art, but it may actually have been Oceanus's own tail, because the same scene is depicted on another 6th century Greek vase, this time of a kind called a dinos, which is a wine bowl, and Oceanus is again depicted attending the wedding procession, but this time we see him clearly. And he doesn't have legs, but the serpentine body of a sea monster. So this was fitting enough for a titan of an age before the Olympian deities with their perfect human forms, although in later Greek art he appears fully anthropomorphized with legs. The playwright Aeschylus, for example, has him arriving in the Caucasus Mountains, standing on a chariot drawn by winged horses. And in the great altar at Pergamon, he has a fully human form, and his telltale sea snake coils close beside him. In the art of the Roman period, he becomes an extremely popular figure to depict. And this is when he sprouts his appealing, characteristic lobster claws and seaweed-smothered appearance. But something else happens too. He's often depicted as just a head. On Roman mosaics, he regularly appears in suitably aquatic environments, such as baths or coastal towns, as a head or a face without a body. So it's unfortunately become the academic norm to refer to these as masks of Oceanus, but this is misleading, I would argue, as these representations have nothing to do with the theatre, and they aren't masks at all. I think, though it's only my suggestion, that they are better read against two things. First, the Roman concept of the numinous qualities of deities, and their habit of conceiving of them as disembodied entities that imbued places, for example the ocean, with the divine. And second, their improved knowledge of the geography of the world and its vast oceans. In light of which, rather than a mask, I think what these disembodied faces represent is the divine face of the deep, the actual face of the sea itself. It's now thought that the famous face of the mouth of truth, the Bocca della Veritas in Rome, was a representation of Oceanus, and it's been suggested that the hole he famously has for a mouth was originally some sort of a stormwater drain. Sometimes you'll see him, sometimes together with Tethys' wife, at shoulder height coming out of the water. But again, I'm not so sure that this is really supposed to be him coming out of the water, so much as this is his presence manifesting a form right out of the ocean waves. In this marvelous mosaic from Gaziantep in Turkey, the artist seems to be playing with these ideas as we see Oceanus and Tethys rising out of both the ocean and the border of the mosaic itself. And so the border of the image becomes symbolic of the earth-encircling sea, the boundary of the world, and a meta-frame for the mosaic image. One of the reasons that Oceanus became such a popular figure in Roman times is tied up with the success and vastness of the Roman Empire. Its inhabitants believed they had been granted imperium sine fine, empire without end, and so the edges of the earth featured more in their mental map of the world, I suppose, just as they had for Alexander. Naturally, therefore, Oceanus was also in mind because the limits of propriety, the limits of success, the dangers of ambition and the destruction of excess were constant refrains in Roman thinking, measuring and judging their own behavior. The empire may not have had mortal limits, but certainly, if nothing else, the forces of nature and the divine would put limits, in the end, to conquest. And those limits are what Seneca the Elder was speaking to in that opening quotation when he said, "In nature, everything that has magnitude has limits too. Nothing is boundless except Oceanus." Imagining himself talking to Alexander on his relentless march, thinking even about crossing the ocean himself, he continues with words of warning about pointless striving. There lies the motionless ocean, a lifeless bulk of nature, as it were, which here has its appointed end. There are strange and frightful shapes, great monsters in the ocean also, which that deep abyss rears. The light is mingled in dense gloom. The dark makes a curtain for the day. In ponderous bulk, fast-rooted lie the waters. Of stars there are none, or they are unknown. Such, Alexander, is the constitution of nature. Beyond everything is the ocean. And beyond the ocean, nothing. Evidently, the enlarged map and greater knowledge of its waters brought no greater sense of familiarity or affection. Certainly, just like the Greeks, Roman society treated the sea in general as a treacherous place and held it in deep foreboding and reverential angst. Strangely, for all its teeming life and the fish and other marine creatures, which provided so much sustenance and culinary delight, Romans largely thought of it as some kind of watery desert. Further out, beyond the dancing sea nymphs and dolphins all frolicking in the jolly coral palaces of Neptune out at sea, the ocean beyond was really thought of as a dark, deep and terrifying desolation. Loathsome and huge are the monsters, deep and immovable the abyss, as one Roman rhetorician described it. The Roman philosopher Fabianus had similar sentiments. Imagine the awful monsters in the sea. Observe the storms and billows with which it rages, the waves it drives to the shore. Such is the warring of its winds, such the mad rage of the sea when stirred from its lowest depths. There's no anchorage at hand, no safety, all is unknown. Far within its depths, all that is monstrous and imperfect in nature has found a refuge. Not even those who fled from Alexander sought those seas. Oceanus, whom nature has poured around the world, is something sacred. And of course, sacred doesn't necessarily mean something pleasant or comfortable, simply something to be revered and treated very carefully. The idea was that these waters were not navigable, and even if they were, they ought not to be navigated. Perhaps most evocative and most bleak of all is the fragment of a lost poem by Albinovanus Pado, who had served under the general Germanicus Caesar in the 1st century CE, and he wrote an epic poem detailing his military campaign called The Voyage of Germanicus. And the extant fragment of the poem is exciting because it depicts a dreadful storm that overtook the fleet as it headed into the North Sea, into what was felt to be the forbidden domain of Oceanus. Already they see the day and sun left far behind, long exiled as they are from the well-known limits of the world, daring to go through gloom forbidden to the bounds of creation and the farthest shores of the universe. And now they behold the ocean, which has monsters beneath its sluggish waves, which bears on all sides savage sharks and dogs of the sea, seizing their ships and rising high in wrath. The very crashing of its billows swells their fear. And now they feel their ships settling on a shoal and their fleet abandoned by the swift winds, and believe that they are left at last by the careless fates to be mangled in a doom unhappy by the wild beasts of the sea. And one aloft on the high prow, striving to pierce the dark mist with straining eye, when his strength availed not to discern anything amid the loss of the world, poured out his imprisoned soul in words like these. Whither are we carried off? Day itself flees, and nature, at the limit of her sway, shrouds the abandoned world in eternal gloom. Do we mean to search for races that dwell beyond this under another sky, and for a world untouched by the blasts of the storm? The gods are calling us back, and forbid mortal eyes to know the ends of things. Why are we violating alien seas and sacred waters with our oars, and troubling the calm abodes of the gods? And so, dear friends, like those forlorn sailors, tremulous of going where they should not and seeing what they ought not, we too must turn back here. We have also reached the furthest flung extremity of our expedition, and having reached the foreboding domain of Oceanus and the brink of all that is mortal, our exploration of Rome's religious landscape must turn back, where the sun slakes his beams and ocean's briny baths. Ahead, maybe there are the islands of the blessed, or the gardens of the Hesperides. Some say Oceanus eventually leads to the fields of Elysium, or plunges into Tartarus, or simply segues into Skye. But ours is not to know. We pay our respects to the great Ocean Father and set sail for Rome once more. And following Alexander's example, as we halt at our furthest reach and set a course for more familiar shores, we can propitiate Oceanus with an Orphic hymn dedicated specifically to him, which has miraculously survived the millennia, so we can address him directly in terms he once heard. And I'll leave you with the words of an ancient prayer. I summon Oceanus, ageless eternal Father, begetter of immortal gods, begetter of mortal men. Your waves, O Oceanus, gird the boundaries of the earth. From you come all the seas, from you come all the rivers, from you come the pure flowing waters of earth's springs. Hear me, O blessed God, O highest, O divine purifier. Where you end, the earth ends. The pole begins where ships slide on. Come, grant favor, grant grace to the initiates.